Hello and welcome to the Arms Control Poser podcast. My name is William Alberque, Director of Strategy, Technology and Arms Control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. I will be your host as we explore the world of arms control. On each podcast, I will interview the great and the good of the arms control community about a current event related to a treaty or agreement, past, present, or only proposed. Then together we will go, hopefully, deep enough on the history and functioning of the agreement to help you make sense of it all. And, well, that's the idea anyway. This podcast is funded by the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium. Now let's get underway. And now on with the show. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Simona Soare, the Professor of Strategy and Technology at Lancaster University, and someone very well known to the IISS family here. Today we're going to talk about whether efforts to control certain aspects of artificial intelligence can be successful. It's a great topic, and I'm really glad to have you here today. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Very nice to join you, William. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, well, let's get down to brass tacks. What is the problem here that we're trying to solve? Is it possible to control artificial intelligence in a meaningful way? As you know, it's a technology that is well embedded within civilian applications as well as military applications. So, kick us off, please.
So as you very well point out, artificial intelligence is a family of technologies that is very much defined as a general purpose technology. Think electricity, think combustion engines. So that, because it is a general purpose technology, it can really be integrated across the society in a variety of use cases that can build towards the commercial, that can build towards the most social aspects, think social media, for instance, but it can also be integrated into far more advanced and sophisticated military applications. I always like to point out the fact that technology in itself is neither good nor bad, but it's also not neutral. So it very much, the way that we understand the technology and the way that we understand the harms that the technology can pose very much depends on the context in which it is used, as well as the intentionality behind its use. And that is in full recognition of the fact that the technology itself, like any other technology and any other innovation, is not perfect. It's brittle, it's got issues, it has still quite a long way to be developed in terms of the technical side. But trying to control it from that point of view, trying to control a general purpose technology from that point of view is going to be incredibly, incredibly difficult, especially with what is the kind of knowledge and the tools that are already widely available across the globe as open source material. So these are available to everyone out there.
All right, I think I understand that. I guess some of the question is a little bit deeper. What are the specific technologies that we are most worried about? I mean, artificial intelligence, it's a whole basket of issues here. What is it we're trying to control when we talk about the control of artificial intelligence? I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, there's a general purpose, there's huge applications to this technology, but when we get to the specifics, what are the military or defense or security applications that one worries about and that we need to think about how to control?
So one thing to point out is that there are no different technologies within the AI family that apply to the commercial civil world and to the military world. So you can't very neatly separate those from a technological point of view. What is important to highlight, though, is that the same technology, the same means of building up the AI, for instance, through machine learning or through deep learning. So the point to make here is that there are no differences in the technology itself between civilian commercial applications and more military inclined ones. So from a technological point of view, you can deploy machine learning, you can deploy deep learning, and you can train them through different techniques and deploy them in the commercial sector and in the military sector. We're talking essentially about the same technology here. but the application will be different. And therefore, the use case itself, so the way that you want to apply it, the purpose to which you want to apply the technology, will in very, very large degree define the harms and the risks as well that the technology use generates. That's one of the big differences to keep in mind. And to answer your question, unlike, for instance, other more conventional technologies that we used to look at from an arms control point of view, think nuclear, for instance, or some precision guided munitions or others, it was very easy to differentiate between, okay, what has military use and what has purely commercial use. With AI, we're not really in a very good position to make that distinction. And so it's very difficult to say, are we trying to control machine learning? Are we trying to control specific types of applications of machine learning? I think we are, as a society, particularly in the West, in Europe certainly, we are coming close through the AI Act to have a better understanding of what kind of harms produced by artificial intelligence we are trying to limit. So, for instance, we very much want to avoid any kind of uses of the technology that will result in existential, life-threatening harms to humans, such as the use of artificial intelligence to empower lethal autonomy. Right? So I think that we definitely do not want to go down that road. We also do not want to go down the road, or we want to control more the application of the technology itself when it comes to the cognitive aspects. So for instance, think about the fact that humans interact with others on social media, interact nowadays with chatbots. So we want to avoid perhaps or limit the extent to which artificial intelligence is being employed to shape our cognitive space, to shape our informational space, and therefore reinforce or create polarization in our society. Those would be other types of applications that specifically the European Union is looking into limiting. Another application is to do with the use of artificial intelligence for the processing of biometric data, because the purposes of the application of the technology can be so widespread. So you can use it very legitimately to more effectively control the security of your borders, for instance, but you can also use it for political repression against dissidents, or you can use it for persecution against specific minorities that you do not necessarily like. So the use of that technology and the kind of harms that it can result in, I think it's the application is very much looked at very, very closely with a view to regulating and to controlling its use as much as possible. So we're not talking about controlling the technology itself. We're not even talking about controlling specific types of artificial intelligence, but we're rather taking a harms-driven approach. So we're focusing on identifying the harms that we want to absolutely avoid through the application of this technology. And then in the European context, targeting our regulation around how can we limit the deployment of artificial intelligence applications for those specific harms.
Okay, so yes, I think I understand that. So as you described, there's two basic buckets that you could put artificial intelligence and controls into. One is in terms of artificial intelligence that supports decision-making on the employment of lethal force, and the other bucket is on facial recognition and sort of societal controls through artificial intelligence. Now, on that latter category, that's really complex, because it strikes me that it's very difficult to ever draw the line between security and repression. I mean, this is something that all societies wrestle with. You think of an airport where activities that you would think of in any other context would be incredibly private, and that the means of trying to make an airport secure you would think of in another context as being incredibly repressive and unacceptable. In an airport, we consider them completely normal. Taking off parts of your clothing, your shoes, all that kind of stuff. Facial recognition, looking at your passport, everything, every move is controlled. So if you build that type of control, and then you scale it up to a society, to a city, to a country, and everyone is being controlled everywhere they go. Everyone's being facially recognized. Everyone's being tracked. What you're carrying, all that kind of stuff. That strikes me that that kind of scalability is very difficult to control. I mean, once you've established it in controlled areas and protected areas, you can scale that up. Or am I going down the wrong road there? Is that a technology that's easy to control?
No, the scalability is very, very easy to do in practice, as long as you have the data and as long as you have the remit, the legal remit to go about fusing the data from different contexts and from different pools and apply it to the purpose that you're trying to achieve here, whether it's, again, security or whether it's political oppression, for instance. So I think that is the ease with which the technology enables that practice. It's very much scary to us at this point. It's also scary to see how easily it can scale at the national as well as at the international level. Right? So imagine that if you are employing facial recognition, you can employ facial recognition, for instance, for law enforcement purposes in a very, very legitimate way because the legal basis is there for you to do so. And those legal controls onto how you can use the technology when under specific considerations and conditions and with the agreement of the courts, that is something that's very much possible into the future. But for the same technology, you can also contemplate its wide-scale deployment to identify individuals of interest who are, associated with very different political opinions or who are associated, again, with specific minorities that are not well looked upon in certain political regimes. So that is where the harms part comes in. So how do you ensure that harm does not materialize from the use of artificial intelligence for facial recognition in this way? And it's not something that you can ensure through.
So how do you do that? I mean, that strikes me as impossible.
Well, exactly. That's the point that's super important to make here, is that it's the same technology.
Yeah.
They're
Huh.
not two different types of technologies that are technically separable. That's where the context and the intentionality of the use of the technology is incredibly important. About 3 years ago, myself and Professor Joe Burton and Professor Ruben Steff have edited a book on emerging technologies and international security. And it was one of the first attempts to look at not just artificial intelligence, but really a wider cast of emerging technologies, quantum and others, and think about what are the implications for international security from the application of these newcomers, new innovations onto the scene. And my contribution to that paper was to say that the use of the technology and the harms that the technology can produce are very much driven by the political context in which it sits. And I appreciate that a lot of people will say, well, yes, but the Western countries have a track record of applying new technologies, including digital tools like digital forensics and so on, for more or less legitimate purposes, such as counterterrorism, for instance, or mass surveillance. And we've had this argument time and again, particularly in relation with the post 9/11 measures that the US implemented. But I think that there's a distinction to make there, specifically when it comes to artificial intelligence and its political context, the political context in which it is embedded. And that is to highlight the fact that democratic and liberal societies have an ultimate stop to the use of that technology and the harms that it engenders in society or against specific individuals. And that is the judicial system. If you have a problem, if government oversteps, if data is being used in artificial intelligence models in ways that are less than legitimate or unclear from a legal point of view, you can always take that to courts. And you can always do so with the presumption that the courts remain impartial and have the interests of society at heart as well. Whereas in less liberal societies, in authoritarian regimes, that stop in the process doesn't really work, because the political context very much works towards every aspect of society, and the state apparatus works towards the survival of the state and the survival of the regime. So you're losing that critical part of the ecosystem that can actually limit harms to society and to civilians from the deployment of these technologies.
Well, okay, now let's look at this from the other side. So, technologies in terms of automation of weapons. And I always use the example of Herman Kahn in the book On Thermonuclear War back in 1960. I actually wrote about how you could program computers as sort of a doomsday machine to be able to detect if you've been attacked and decapitated by a first strike. And so you could, either have automatic retaliation or what have you. Now, this book, that scenario, actually ended up inspiring Dr. Strangelove, as both Stanley Kubrick and Terry Southern, the writer of the film, had read Herman Kahn and thought, applied this to the most absurd example where the Soviets destroyed the entire Earth with the explosion of a single nuclear weapon. So this is a problem that clearly people have been wrestling with for more than 6 decades. So I guess what I'm asking is, are there real advantages to adding artificial intelligence to weapons decision making? How does putting artificial intelligence or advanced computing analytics into the decision making loop give one side or the other advantage?
Well, I'm happy that you prefaced your question with the fact that we have been using very sophisticated software in military capabilities for a very long time. And I think that there is perhaps a misperception or insufficient public acknowledgement as to the actual level of software that exists within security and defense capabilities nowadays. So in many ways, AI is coming against this background where we have been using digital tools and software in defense for quite a long time. What AI, particularly machine learning, brings as an element of novelty, though, is that it has the capacity to, one, collect data. Once it's programmed, it has the ability to collect the data, it has the ability to analyze it, oftentimes in ways that we do not fully understand. Think about, for instance, image classification. And then it has the capacity through its programming to then just proceed with whatever avenues of action have been built into the technology. With with the sort of general AI, which would be a more sentient, context-aware type of artificial intelligence, the presumption is that it would be able to basically collect the data, understand its context, understand sort of the nuances in very different ways of acting, and be able to, on that basis and through its agency, make decisions and proceed with implementing them. We're not there technologically. We're not. What artificial intelligence applications do well today are essentially to compress the analysis of huge volumes of data, for instance. That is one way in which think large language models. That is one way in which artificial intelligence is very, very advanced today. It's very useful as well in terms of security and defense, simply because this is an area where you have a lot of interest, not just to go through all that data to ensure your situational awareness remains optimal, but also to be able to identify early signs of problems or threats or risks. That is one way in which I'm thinking very much that artificial intelligence is being used today. And think about the use of artificial intelligence for processing ISR data. We're seeing it in Ukraine, for instance, now. One of the key applications of the technology is exactly that, is to sift through a huge amount of data that is generated by ISR sensors out there, and then pull from that threads in terms of locations of enemy units, in terms of potential avenues of how to engage targets, or even targeting, dynamic targeting itself, right? So that is one way that the technology is used. Other ways is through the deployment on loitering munitions. Here it's married, so the technology itself enables functionality in whatever military platform or civilian platform, really, as we've seen from Ukraine, or whatever platform is deployed on. So it enables the autonomous function of said capability. When I say autonomous, I don't necessarily mean lethal autonomy. I don't necessarily mean a military robot or drone will automatically identify and verify a target and then automatically engage it. But I do mean a very much compressed loop in what the US Armed Forces, for instance, refer to as the OODA loop. And that is really the time from when you've identified a security threat to the time when you actually engage it and destroy it, and compress that decision-making process very, very much. So some of the applications of the technology itself are very, very useful in that sense. And you have large language models, so you have computer vision, which is advanced enough to be able to successfully undertake all these tasks. But there are essential limitations in the technology itself. And again, we're seeing this come out of Ukraine. Perhaps the listeners and yourself are very well familiar with tactics to confuse classification that are ongoing in Ukraine, with Russian actors placing tires onto their fighter planes in order to that is a tactic that basically confuses the machine learning model that is helping with classification. It throws it off, and it will no longer identify the fighter jet as what it is, but rather classify it differently. And so this is one area, for instance, where the technology is very brittle. So it's very efficient at analyzing high volumes of data, but it can be thrown off very easily. Another example is in the audio context, is we have machine learning applications that can process sound, and they can identify, say, sounds that are made by weapons. So we can have an early sign that something's about to happen, such as a shooting, for instance, because the machine learning model can identify the safety being lifted, or they can identify other types of sounds that might be problematic from a law enforcement, from a security, from an intelligence point of view. They can pick up voice, they can pick up conversations remotely, but at the same time, the technology itself, so these types of models, can also be very, very easily thrown off with the deployment of countermeasures, with the deployment of sounds on frequencies that the human ear cannot hear or pick up. But the algorithm, the machine learning model, does pick them up, and it can throw it off completely and fool it to think that it's hearing something it's not actually hearing. So all of this is the long way to say that the technology is incredibly, incredibly useful for military applications. Some military applications are more ready to deploy than others. But at the same time, it comes with some significant limitations that we need to be aware of. And this is where I think the conversation about how do you control the technology, meaning the application, the use case, comes from. This is where the entire narrative around the human in the loop versus the human on the loop or out of the loop is linked to. It's been baked into the high-level conversations that are taking place into the GGE around laws, for instance, around lethal autonomous weapons, as to what is the proper and thorough and sufficient level of human control that needs to be exercised over these capabilities. At which point in their design, development, and deployment does this control need to be exercised in order to be quote unquote meaningful. This is the term that the GGE has used quite significantly. And I think a lot of colleagues in the community that work on artificial intelligence for military applications also use it. And also, what are the absolutely critical features of that human control that need to be exercised in order to satisfy the condition of sufficient control over the technology itself? So is it sufficient that the loitering munition deployed as an autonomous lethal capability, is it sufficient if it has an off switch? Is that enough in terms of human meaningful control over it or not? So that's the conversation around what does it actually mean to control it are very much in flux. I think that for a long time the conversation has focused at the high level, that is very much vague, that's very much encompassing from a technological point of view. And perhaps in order for us to advance it, we would have to come down and think about control as an application specific feature rather than as a technology general one.
All right, this is a good place to take a break. We'll be back in just a second with Dr. Simona Soare. You're listening to the Arms Control Poser podcast. Wow. Well, I mean, that's a very comprehensive way to think about how computing helps in terms of decision making. But it still comes down to the humans making a decision, even making a decision when to employ artificial intelligence to help you with decision making. And on autonomy of weapon systems, I mean, it strikes me that a guided missile, for instance, once it's fired, becomes an autonomous system. It seeks to acquire a target based on certain conditions. It follows that target and it destroys it. So this isn't really a new problem. And it still comes down to the decision by the human to employ that missile for the purpose of destroying another aircraft or ship or land target or what have you. So that brings me to the question, what is there something really new here?
But I had a thought about what you're saying, because there is a level of distinction there and nuance that needs to be recognized when it comes to artificial intelligence. And this makes the difference between machine learning applications and advanced software that is already deployed on missiles, for instance, as you mentioned earlier. Is there is a level of autonomy that's inbuilt in these. There's a level of autonomy that's inbuilt into, for instance, air defense systems, into perimeter defense systems for guarding very sensitive military locations. But
right, and again, you think about a ship with a defensive system designed to intercept missiles. You would tie the machine guns to cameras and radars to operate quicker than a human operator could in order to intercept a fast-moving aircraft or ship coming towards your boat. So, and to me, that's a degree of autonomy, right?
Absolutely. So that is also an autonomous function by all means and purposes.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about autonomy as a function of military capabilities that is enabled by machine learning, that is very much a different proposition, because it would not come as a result of pre-programming. Look, whatever autonomous capabilities we have now, and we're using them, and we have been using them for a few decades now, they come as pre-programmed. All the conditions, the missiles, the air defense systems, they have the perimeter systems, defense systems, they have some autonomy in terms of pre-programming. How far, how fast does a target need to move in order for me to classify it as such. So there is classification involved there. So they are using classification systems that are perhaps more rudimentary than machine learning, but they are classification systems. They are using parameters such as perimeter, for instance. If anything comes within my defense area, then I'll automatically shoot it down. Or, I have a preloaded set of approved targets for the missile that are loaded onto the system for the missile to potentially engage. All of these are predetermined and pre-programmed by humans, right?
Right.
The capability does not respond in real time to its circumstances to the degree that a machine learning model can. Think about dynamic targeting, where you have a drone that is just flying around in its established area of operations, right? and it spots an enemy artillery unit, right? It doesn't necessarily come with a preloaded set of programmable actions to automatically engage it. But if it's deployed as such, it will not need human verification. It will use its classification system to identify the piece of artillery as enemy artillery, and it will automatically engage it. That's the level of autonomy, the scope of autonomy that we're talking about when it comes to the ability of the machine to make potentially life-threatening decision. That sounds, efficient in some ways, but it also sounds incredibly dangerous because the technology can easily be fooled into seeing what it's not seeing. We have a range of countermeasures under development now. Some very sophisticated technologically, think new paints, adaptive camouflage, and materials, adaptive materials, but think also very rudimentary countermeasures. It's enough to change one pixel on whatever it is that the capability is looking at to trick it into thinking it's looking at something else. So if it sees a piece of enemy artillery and it takes it out, fine, that's what's programmed to do. But if it sees a school bus and it thinks it's an enemy artillery, this is an extreme example, obviously, but there are examples out there, by the way, that are just as out of this world as the example I've given you in terms of how the technology can easily be tricked.
Sure, but at the same time, there is no foolproof technology, including humans and the human eye. I mean, how many times have humans, even with advanced computers to help them with targeting, still made the wrong decision? Do you know what I mean? So it's still the person. Artificial intelligence may be able to change the scope of bad decisions that can be made, but ultimately any system is only good as the human that set the system up, that designed it, that controls it, that guides it and employs it. It's ultimately a human decision. And so if you take a human out of the loop, well, there are plenty of instances in the world where there were no computers in the loop and the decisions were still terrible and there were still horrible human consequences or unintended consequences from the employment of weapon systems.
But absolutely, for the purposes of how our polities are built today, from a political theory and political practice point of view, also from a legal theory point of view, both the process of using a technology on the battlefield as well as the outcomes of using that technology on the battlefield relate to human responsibility, relate to human accountability in a way that is direct and material, right? Someone pushed the button to fire a missile. Someone made the decision to deploy a kamikaze drone, right?
Sure.
That is directly and materially linked to a human decision. With artificial intelligence, you can't necessarily establish that link. We are talking, for instance, today about developing responsible and trustworthy AI. This is a huge conversation, not just from a military and security point of view, but really from a societal security point of view. And the approach there is to think about what is responsible AI from early design phases through development, through deployment and use, and all the way down to decommissioning. And that's super useful to think in that sense. Unfortunately, one of the big gaps in that approach is the human agency, is the context that we were talking about earlier, is you cannot pre-establish that the technology will not be used for nefarious purposes, that you cannot control the nefarious intent behind its use in the same way. And if you can, for instance, efforts with lethal autonomy, revolve around principles of responsible use or establishing a collective understanding that the responsibility and accountability for the use of fully autonomous lethal capabilities relies with humans ultimately, regardless of the outcomes. That is a very, very useful tool to move forward. As long as we understand that it's voluntary, as long as we understand, as you very, very well know, from more conventional arms control is that the parties can and often have very different interpretation of the same sentence, of the same black and white on white text that they're looking at and reading. The same thing applies with lethal autonomy or really other types of AI applications in military capabilities. So as long as we can allow for that to happen and understand the limitations of this being a voluntary exercise and having very little control over issues around verifying that indeed someone is using it legally or is using it quote unquote responsibly, it is very, very difficult, and it's very context dependent as well.
Well, that's a good point. And I think that's a good place to pivot. So, what are the major efforts to control the types of artificial intelligence and high-level computing that we've been talking about today? What are the main efforts? Are they successful? Where are they occurring?
So I'd say we have three levels at which we see both national as well as supranational international actors try to build in controls over artificial intelligence applications, particularly when it comes to the military domain. The first level is really to build a governance of the technology itself and potential military applications. And we're seeing a number of countries around the globe developing artificial intelligence specific strategies or defense AI specific strategies. So in the transatlantic context, we do have the US, we do have the UK and France, and more recently Norway, which have put forward defense AI strategies. Now, what these instruments do, these very high-level instruments do, is establish a level of governance over the use of that technology in military contexts, right? There are other elements to how you can establish governance of artificial intelligence. Say, the use of ethical boards for the control of the development of these AI applications for military use before they actually get deployed. That's something that's already ongoing. Again, the US, the UK, France have well-established ethical committees in their defense apparatus when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence. A different way of thinking about governance, which we're seeing very much gaining more interest at the moment, is the supranational level. So we're looking at actors such as the UN. The UN has already had 8 or 9 years now of discussing within the governmental experts group on lethal autonomous weapons the issue of lethal autonomy, the issues of how do you ensure meaningful human control over the application of lethal autonomy. So we're seeing another level of development of global governance on this issue. We're seeing more regional attempts as well, supranational regional attempts at building governance of artificial intelligence. Say the European Union. The European Union was one of the first to establish a group of experts to identify principles of ethical, responsible, and trustworthy artificial intelligence. OSCE had a similar process. Council of Europe had similar processes of trying to identify jointly those key principles that defined responsible technological development and application of artificial intelligence. These were more broad in scope, not necessarily focused on the military domain. There are some examples. For instance, definitely the European Union has been through the paces and the processes of thinking, especially within the European Defence Agency format, thinking about what does responsible AI mean in a military context. Again, building up towards that governance of artificial intelligence for military applications. And some of our more difficult partners or adversaries like Russia and China have certainly adopted ethical principles for the deployment and use of artificial intelligence, either in a societal scope or in security and defense applications. So this is one way that we can think about controlling, if you'd like, artificial intelligence. The second level is to think about control over the technology from an economic statecraft or export control point of view, right? So this is where national efforts, but also more recently, supranational coordination mechanisms come into play. I'll give you an example. For instance, the use of economic statecraft tools and export controls by the US administration to limit not just the use of the diffusion and export of specific types of semiconductors to countries like China or to countries like Russia in the context of the sanctions against Russia over the war in Ukraine. Those would fall into the remit of this sort of instrument to control the diffusion of artificial intelligence. Another way to think about this is coordination mechanisms. For instance, recently the European Union established a list of critical technologies for its security and for economic competitiveness. Artificial intelligence features as one of those technology families that the European Union is interested to look more closely into developing specific economic statecraft tools where, when applied, it can actually limit the access of nefarious actors to its technological innovation in this space, or it can limit the exportability of these technologies to specific countries or to specific political contexts. That's another way to think of the supranational coordination mechanism for the applicability of economic statecraft and arms control. There are conversations around, for instance, whether more conventional tools, export control tools, such as the Wassenaar Agreement, that of course works with a list of predefined dual-use technologies that are subject to export controls and specific approvals, whether those kinds of instruments require some updating or potentially some rethinking so that we can more easily fit applications of artificial intelligence or specific components of the AI hardware stack into the list of the Wassenaar Agreement, so that we control a little bit more the diffusion of highly advanced applications of AI. Those are some of the tools that are developing right now or that are being updated. And last but not least, I'd like to say one very, very short sentence about the fact that as a general purpose technology, again, we see efforts to control the export of these technologies are beginning to permeate other types of engagements between international actors. Think about, for instance, of the AUKUS agreement. Most recently, I think as recently as this week, the US, the UK, and Australia, which of course are parties to the AUKUS agreement, have also convened and had conversations about what kind of export controls measures they need to coordinate at a national level and amongst each other in order to ensure that adversarial access to these specific technologies does not occur, or that unwanted dissemination, diffusion of specific types of applications of machine learning does not occur. So how can you better control the diffusion or the access to your technological innovation in artificial intelligence? So these are part and parcel of the types of arrangements such as AUKUS. I would argue that even the Quad has quite a substantial element and is potentially a platform for those types of conversations to develop and thrive into the future if they're not already happening.
You mentioned that. So Russia and China, you said, have ethical guidelines for the use of artificial intelligence in decision making?
Yes.
Right. Do you think that,
indeed,
in terms of values, that they're aligned with the same kinds of issues that we wrestle with, or because they come from a different ethical underpinning, are they deciding on this in a very different way than the way that the West would decide on keeping a human in the loop, the need to do so, the ethics of that?
When it comes to reading the text of these ethical principles for artificial intelligence or for responsible artificial intelligence, you do see a huge similarity with, especially in terms of terminology, in terms of the actual words that are being used in text. You do see a lot of similarity with either national efforts on the Western Front or with international efforts, particularly those within the UN. So we're talking about issues such as explainability, right, of artificial intelligence. We're talking about more transparency built into the models themselves. So there's obviously a concern on both sides as to how can we ensure human control over the technology. Whether there is 100% alignment between the Western views of what responsible and trustworthy AI mean and the Chinese or the Russian understandings of how to implement that, I would not necessarily see that full alignment at this point. And again, this doesn't boil down to the technology or to a technological solution. It boils down to the context, the political context, and the intentionality within that political context that the technology is deployed for. And that is a little bit of an irreconcilable situation because, yes, for China and for Russia, controlling their information environment is very much a high priority. So obviously, or ensuring the survival of the regime is very much one of the highest priorities, if not the highest. So then the technology will be deployed to support those purposes. Whereas in more Western contexts, a lot of the use cases around the social credit system are very much regarded as highly irresponsible, I would, and illegitimate to some degree, I would say. So I don't necessarily see a full alignment on that. But having said that, the format in which you develop governance for a specific technology also gives it a specific nuance for implementation. So I don't necessarily see a full alignment in terms of the understanding of how to implement the principles of ethical and responsible AI, even between different global or regional formats. So is the implementation of the principles of responsible AI as agreed in the Council of Europe the same in substance as those agreed in the OSCE, as those agreed in a UN format? So there are slight differences there. Even when we go to the understanding at the national level of how these principles apply, and I've done this a few years ago. I was writing a chapter on military uses of artificial intelligence throughout Europe. And I wanted to look at whether all the member states of the European Union and NATO had, first of all, had an understanding of what human meaningful control of lethal autonomy was, and two, whether that understanding and definition of meaningful human control was the same or was similar. And I've come to the conclusion that one, looking at the data, not all member states have a view on what meaningful human control is. Actually, more than half of them don't have an understanding of that, or don't have a definition of what meaningful human control is when it comes to the application of lethal autonomy in military context. And then when it comes to how those that do have such a thing, when it comes to how they understand to implement human meaningful control, there is not necessarily a convergence there. There is not necessarily unanimity and agreement in all aspects of implementing human meaningful control over lethal autonomy. So I would say there are always differences, national, regional, to be accounted for. That's not necessarily what I'm concerned here with. What I'm concerned about deeply is the fact that our understanding of how to implement responsible and trustworthy AI in a military context, even when based on the same text, could actually differ significantly. It wouldn't be the first time that this happens. Again, I go back to your background as in arms control. I think people can choose to have a very different approach to implementation. And with the type of technology that we're talking about, this is all the more facilitated by the technological specificities.
So, if you could look into your crystal ball and think about the future environment regarding these technologies, where they're going to be applied in the future, how governance is going, where do you think we're going here? Do you think there are areas of convergence among countries, even among adversaries, on what to limit and what to ban? Do you think there are divergences here that will prevent the United Nations or other regional bodies to come to real agreement that can help manage this technology space? Or do you think global competition is just at a point where controls are going to be very, very difficult to agree upon?
Well, I think, I don't know. I'm really interested actually to hear your thoughts on what is it that we can take from the rich history of arms control and confidence building measures around more conventional technologies, and what is it that we can take from this and apply it to something like artificial intelligence? Because it seems to me as though, for instance, arms control tends to be very successful if, two conditions are met. One is when you have a clear understanding of what the technology can do, and you agree that the risks are not necessarily worth the payoff.
Right.
And you know that the other party has the capacity, has the technological capacity to deliver as well. So there's a little bit of certainty there on both sides as to what the technology does, what the risks are, and how unacceptable they are, and the fact that the enemy can technologically deliver. The second one is really when you have a situation of monopoly over a technology and you are in a position as an international actor to really enforce the control of the diffusion of said technology. But with artificial intelligence, it seems to me, we are in neither of those situations. So what does this actually mean for its control? One, I think we are still very far from fully understanding the impact that the technology can have on the battlefield. I think we're seeing some initial inputs and insights come out of Ukraine, but are those really the full extent of what the technology can do when deployed on the battlefield? I would express some skepticism around that. So we don't really have a full understanding of really how revolutionary the technology is to the battlefields today. And second, we don't really have a full understanding of whether the risks of deploying it are so unacceptable at this point, even though we understand that the adversary might have the technological prowess to deliver. So those are two things. And then second, definitely, this is not a technology that can, is in a monopoly situation where you can actually control its diffusion. Even when we're talking about issues such as sovereign AI, which is the development of specific applications and capabilities as a landed national process and national capability, we're really not talking about different technologies here. We're talking about the same technology. It's just that you're grounding the process in a national context, and you are grounding the building of the technology and its capability, and the capability it sits within in a national context. We're not talking about controlling the technology. We're not talking about different technologies themselves. So I don't necessarily see either of those conditions being fully met for us to say we are in any way, shape, or form going to be able to fully control the diffusion of artificial intelligence. And we are not able to control its use, as it's becoming absolutely evident by this point. And that applies to other international actors as well as the private sector as well. Going back to the sort of discussions in the public domain about ChatGPT and not other similar models. But I'd really be interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, thanks. I mean, for me, I've been trying to find a way to systematically approach this topic because I think there's this huge appetite to say, we have to have arms control for new technologies. without really thinking about how difficult it is and when is it appropriate and how is it appropriate, how do we quantify this? And so here I want to highlight a paper written by Jane Weineman and Tristan Volpe, published in September 2023, called Dual Use Deception. And I think they had a really great way of breaking this all down and making this very, very simple, and then testing their methodology among technologies throughout time that have been applied to the military applications and efforts to govern them. And so what they did was they looked at it through the questions of integration and distinguishability. So if a technology is completely integrated in civilian and military applications, it becomes very, very hard to govern. Similarly, if the actual technology itself is easy to distinguish, is easy to see, to verify. So if you think about it on those two matrices, on the x-axis you have integration, on the y-axis you have distinguishability. You can say the things that have very high distinguishability and very low integration between civil and military applications are very easy to control. But like artificial intelligence, this is the perfect storm here, right? Because here you have very, very high integration and very, very low distinguishability. It's integrated between civil and military applications, and its distinguishability is very, very low. And therefore, it becomes almost impossible to govern through sort of traditional arms control agreements. So, it's the worst aspect. Artificial intelligence, it seems like it's the worst of all worlds in terms of controls.
But one of the things that strikes me as perhaps useful in thinking about when it comes to the deployment of AI in military context is, on the one hand, it's super important to think about being able to identify the technology being deployed. And I'm not talking about seeing the drone fly, because the drone can fly, it can be remotely operated. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's enabled by artificial intelligence. So honing our tools to understand when the technology is being used, and whether this means evolving from our current focus on specific telemetry indicators, or whether it means, really refining them, that's an ongoing conversation. But it's incredibly necessary, because this goes towards accountability and responsibility, and limiting as much as possible international actors' deniability that artificial intelligence is being used in the first place. And there are conversations you can have about, and think about confidence building measures. But this boils down to my second point here, which is trust but verify, right? So while we're honing in tools to identify when the technology is being used in a military application, we also need to be able to verify, to test. And going back to the point about responsible AI, I mean, look, don't get me wrong. I think that the European Union is doing a great thing in pushing forward regulation such as the EU AI Act, which is very much regulating and mitigating against specific, particularly critical harms around the use of artificial intelligence in commercial civilian contexts. That's the remit of its application. But at the same time, these tools are inherently limited, as are economic statecraft tools, by the lack of testing, verification, capacity. If you cannot test that something is compliant to your regulation, then you've only taken the step halfway to where it needs to be. And you're inherently reliant on your suppliers and providers, some of which might come from regimes where you have serious security concerns. You're relying on their word that they are compliant without an independent capacity to verify that compliance. In a military context, that is nearly impossible or extremely difficult to do. I mean, in your experience, how many countries would give access to an independent party to verify their military technologies, particularly sensitive ones such as artificial intelligence, which is potentially using capabilities that are not disclosed, or data that they don't want out into the hands of others, or sources that they don't want disclosed. So this is a very complicated proposition to say, okay, we'll do verification because of the sensitivity around its military use.
Well, I think that's right because, even with IAEA safeguards, you don't actually have access to nuclear facilities that have military applications. It's actually completely sequestered. You only in safeguards have access to civilian applications, to declared civilian applications, or under the additional protocol to undeclared applications. But military applications, you can declare that you have them and then exclude them from actual safeguards. And similarly with the Chemical Weapons Convention, it's incredibly complicated to set up a verification regime that protects civilian commercial equities. So verification becomes very, very hard to do. In theory, it's easy, but in the application, it just becomes incredibly complicated.
But does this mean that it's a hopeless situation?
I mean, does it? I still think it's something that we need to think about, and I still think there is work to be done. But, this sort of easy answer of, well, we just have a treaty with intrusive on-site verification that we're used to, that's probably not at all possible with artificial intelligence.
I share your skepticism on this topic because I think that we are talking about a different realm, and in general, the digital component, whether today is artificial intelligence, tomorrow it might be quantum and others. I think that the digital component is very sensitive to governments, is very key and critical to their security, and therefore for technological specificity reasons as well as for national security reasons, is very difficult to approach using the same tools that have been successfully used in the past for arms control purposes, or even for export control purposes.
Well, I think that's about right. And frankly, I think there's just a lot here that we still don't know. I think there's a lot of work that we still have to do. So, Simona, I want to thank you. I think this conversation has been really amazing. I feel like I've learned so much on this topic, and I want to thank you for sharing with us your experience and your wisdom today. And hopefully we can have you on the podcast once again in the future. Simona, thank you.
You're very welcome.
And that wraps it up for part 1 of the podcast. We're going to take a little pause. We'll come back with part 2. We're going to talk to Simona about her life and times. How did she get here, and what did she learn along the way? Back in just a minute. And we're back with part 2 of the Arms Control Poser podcast. We are here today with Simona Soare to talk to her about her life and times, her career. How did she get here? So, Simona, please tell me, is artificial intelligence, advanced technologies, were these topics that you've always been interested in? Did you grow up as a kid, thinking about artificial intelligence and controlling them, or, fears of how they could be applied? Or is this something that you came to much later through your studies and writings and all that? How did this all start?
Surprisingly, I was very much focused on political science, and I'm trained as a political scientist, and my specialization obviously is strategic studies. I've always been fascinated by military interactions and issues around national security. And that was sort of the thing that I've chosen, I believe, late in my college studies. In what I want to do is really focus on strategic studies. So my undergrad and my postgrad and my PhD are all in international security. But I would say that focusing on, I remember when I was trying to decide on what I wanted to do for a PhD, what my topic would be, and I kept thinking, I kept sort of going back to the evolution of warfare, and technology was very much a big part of it, but I've always struggled with the fact that I don't necessarily buy into or agree with the very techno-focused and techno-driven understanding and characterization of the evolution of warfare. That was one thing that I remember I'm sort of struggling with and still do today. is because I'm a firm believer in human agency and choices around the use of different technologies and their deployment for specific outcomes. So my interest in artificial intelligence, but also in technology for warfare purposes, happened pretty early on. And then I was very fortunate to work as an analyst and researcher in a defense establishment where I was able to focus not just on the research and development and industrial capacity of specific countries, but really think very, very practically about how technologies are being integrated into and become part of military capabilities of systems and platforms. And what does this mean? And that has really cemented my passion for the topic. Obviously, the technologies themselves, the list of technologies has evolved. It's a fluid process, right? And technological progress is far faster today than it was even 50 years ago. So I'm continuously thinking about what is the next technology that's coming on the horizon that potentially has significant military applications, and how do we approach it. But that's pretty much been the trail that brought me to work on defense innovation and emerging and disruptive technologies.
Still, I mean, this pretty hard field to get a job in. So, how did you go from your studies to work? Did you just apply for a job in the newspaper? Were there obvious routes into the professional study and writing field from academia?
Well, I think if you think of military studies, you think of your career paths are not an open-ended field. So you do think of research and the academic field as one potential area, and obviously this is something that I've chosen several times in my career so far, including at the moment. So conducting research that can drive policy or impact policy, or shape policy. That's something that's really important to me, and I've done this back home in Romania, working on national security issues and defense capability development issues. I've also done this in roles at IISS, or in my previous posting at the European Union International Institute for Strategic Studies. I've ballsed that up. It's the European Union Institute for Security Studies. Too many ISSs. Stop calling things ISS. And I also do this in my current role at Lancaster University, where I'm very much focused on defense innovation and emerging and disruptive technologies. There are options to join the armed forces, so to be a practitioner or an end user of that technology, or to be involved in the development pipeline, in the research and development pipeline from within the defense establishment. There's a career path as a developer in an industrial context, so become part of industry that can support the understanding of how technologies can be integrated into defense. Or you can become a policymaker, right, where you can approach the integration and use of these technologies from a policy point of view. And I've done that as well. And it has been a very rewarding and fascinating part of my career at the European Parliament, where I've worked. I was immensely lucky to be able to work on some key regulations and legislation in security and defense that affect the whole of the European Union and the European pillar of the North Atlantic Alliance. I'm talking about the European Defence Fund and its precursor programs, the Preparatory Action on Defence Research and European Defence Industrial and Development Program. And these regulations are essentially about how do you develop technologies that are key for your security and defense? How do you successfully integrate them into your armed forces, into military capabilities? And what are the guardrails around their use? How do you fund those? It's a very, very interesting, very rewarding process to go through.
Wow. So let me ask you one last question to close out our conversation today. If you could go back in time to any point in your career and give yourself advice to help you get through this all better, to get to a better point, to rough out some hard patches, is there anything that you would go back and tell yourself to make things a little bit easier than they were?
I would say always choose something that you're passionate about, because things go into fashion and they fall out of fashion. And it's very difficult to stick to something as a career choice if you're ultimately not interested in working on that, if you don't find it rewarding, and if you don't find the engagement with your community absolutely rewarding every single time. That's one thing that I would advise myself. And in hindsight, I'm happy that even if I didn't get this advice, I still sort of went in this direction. The second advice that I would give myself is narrow and focused wins the race. As in, your specialization matters a lot. Nobody will know everything about everything. And again, subjects will come into fashion or they'll fall out of grace. When I was doing my studies, my PhD studies, counterterrorism was all the fashion. Middle Eastern studies, same thing. My chosen topic to work on theory of international relations, to work on science and technology studies, to work on the evolution of warfare, were very much, to put it very bluntly, I was asked by academic advisors quite a few times, where the end of history is here. Why are you working on the evolution of warfare? So that's where I think passion and things that we care about play into our decisions. And I'd say that is definitely something that you have to stick with. Specialize in something, try to work and consolidate your career onto that topic, rather than try to achieve and do everything. Narrow and focused is what I would say. Stay narrow and focused onto the specialization that you want to pursue.
Well, I think that is great advice. And I want to thank you so much for sharing with us about your life and your career. And like I said, I hope to have you on the podcast again. Simona, thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you, William, today.
And that's the end of part 2 of the podcast. I want to thank Dr. Simona Soare once again for being on the show today. I want to thank the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortia for funding the project. As always, thank you to B. Aubrey Freeman for the amazing music. See you next time on the Arms Control Poser podcast.
I repeat again. I repeat again. I repeat again. I repeat again.